This is Casey's Book Talk, and I am the teacher. And Casey, why don't you start by talking about what the book that you read is called, who it's by, and giving us a 100-word or less summary of the plot, and maybe mentioning the time setting of the book as well.
Okay. Well, I read The Godfather by Mario Puzo.
Okay.
And most people know it from the movies. I mean, Godfather's parts 1, 2, and 3.
Right.
And in fact, I only read it very recently. I guess I've wanted to read it for quite a long time, but I've only read it recently because I love those films. And I was curious to see how much the films retain the original content from the novel, because the novel's fairly tome-like. It's a pretty good-sized book. And
it's always a good idea to read the book before you see the movie or after you've seen the movie. Just a couple quick questions for the book talk. First of all, what genre of work would you say this is?
Well, it is sort of a crime novel, I guess you could say. It's I don't know that I would even really classify it in that sense. The passages that I chose to talk about, many of them focus on the extent to which the mafia leaders in this book become the legitimate governmental forces, organizations of their communities for the people who live within the communities that are concerned, and often supplant the actual larger American governmental systems, police and court systems and such.
But it's fictional officially.
It is fiction.
Crime
No. But I mean, it's hard to escape the idea that you're looking at a work of fiction that very much is connected to the real world of crime. I mean, even there are references to occasionally true crime figures. There are references to Al Capone, the Corleone family, and the Capone family, and the Chicago crime syndicate, and and even some of the characters themselves are based on true figures.
Okay. What level of challenge was this for you as a reader?
Well, I certainly think it was challenging because I'd never read any real sort of gangster fiction type stories. I mean, it's just not something I would typically read. Yeah. I'm a big fan of like Raymond Chandler, like the hard-boiled crime mystery type stories, but this isn't a mystery at all. This is much more complex than that, and it goes off into these really long descriptive passages and narrative passages that go into the different stories of the characters. And that's a piece, I have to be honest, that was a challenge for me because I don't typically read a work that almost reads like a historical fiction in a way, that you have all of these interlocking storylines with this cast of thousands, and it'll take a kind of a sweep to one character's story for 45 pages. And you have to focus on that the whole time you're thinking, well, what happened to the Corleone family? Why aren't we dealing with them? So it's a real stretch for me because I don't typically pick novels like that. I did choose 4 passages, and I could read any one of them, quite honestly. I think, but the one that I like the most is from page 246. So I'll find that here, 246. And what it says there is, it's talking about a meeting of the heads of all of the crime syndicate families, not just in New York, but everywhere. So this is in response to the war that's been going on for quite some time now, in which some of the families have lost not only soldiers, but also family members. And this is after Don Corleone, who is one of the main characters in the story. He is the Godfather, one of the characters who's identified as the Godfather, has lost his oldest son, Sonny, who's been murdered by a rival group. And so at this meeting, they're trying, it's basically, what Puzo's trying to do is parallel the way that heads of state come together in formal official treaty meetings, and they have their representatives and they have treaties on the table and they're discussing possible ways that they can cease hostilities, and Puzo's trying to show the reader how these crime families, these crime syndicates are very much exactly like honest to goodness governments. So the quote is, at the end of the meeting, Don Corleone stands up to speak, and this is what Puzo says. It was then that Don Corleone gave the speech that would be longer remembered and reaffirmed his position as the most far-seeing statesman among them, so full of common sense, so direct from the heart, and to the heart of the matter. In it, he coined a phrase that was to become as famous in its way as Churchill's Iron Curtain, though not public knowledge until more than 10 years later. So in that particular passage, Puzo is talking about this great speech that Corleone gives, and of course he references how this information doesn't become public for a decade because this is a meeting that is done in the utmost secrecy, because clearly if you had all the heads of the crime families in the entire country together, the police might well be interested in that sort of thing.
Right.
And of course the message he gets into, what he talks about, is that they have to work together, not only for their own interests, but for the interests of their own neighborhoods, for the interests of their own businesses, basically to create stability. And the one thing that I took from, one of the key things I took from this reading, is the extent to which, for organized crime to function properly, they want to maintain society and its structures and its stability. And so they literally, some of these crime leaders, some of these family leaders in the book, quite literally assured the peace and the sort of proper functioning. They didn't, for example, let small-time crooks operate in their areas, because that would tend to upset the balance. It would tend to make it so the police would get overly involved with dealing with these sorts of things. So their deals they would make with the police would be, well, we will handle all the small-time kind of stuff if you let us operate. And basically they became extensions of the police, of the courts. They wielded great influence in the court system. So if some of their men got in trouble, they had enough district attorneys and judges and police chiefs in their pockets that they could say, okay, we really want to see this guy not get in much trouble.
So does that, I mean, that's a ton of information and connections, and does that all come from this one book, or are you drawing on?
Yeah, this one passage, the whole reference to Churchill's Iron Curtain speech and all of that, it really does. I mean, we see Puzo presenting these figures in exactly this sort of light.
It sounds to me like it might be not a very action-packed book. Is there also action going on?
Well, you know, that's interesting. You know what it reminded me of? It made me think of when I read Moby Dick years ago. Okay. You know, 550 pages, right? 500 pages of whaling industry and 50 pages of action. Right. You know, and if you were digging, you know, if you're really interested in the whaling industry, then you were in good shape. Right. But there wasn't a lot of action to find.
Yeah. Moby Dick, because it felt like it was amazingly put together. And it seems like a lot of what you're noticing is happening.
I don't think this is as well put together in that sense. It's not as solid a novel, right? Yeah. But there are moments of action, and there are a lot of moments of talk or narrative commentary, or So there's a lot of exposition that happens again and again and again and again throughout the novel because of all the storylines.
And then I said, okay, so one of the things that you talked about a lot was the information that you got from this book. Would you say, I think you mentioned that it was kind of a crime novel. It had a little bit of true crime stuff going on in it. But do you think there are themes that are developed in this book as well, or were they mostly pieces of information that the author was trying to get across to you?
Right. Well, for example, this was a little bit earlier than this scene happened. There was another passage that says, there was no force, no mortal man who could bend them, the crime family leaders, to their will unless they wished it. They were men who guarded their free will with wiles and murder. Their wills could be subverted only by death or the utmost reasonableness. And one of the interesting themes that he develops in this story is how some of the crime leaders are quite violent, and that's their coin and trade.
Right.
Don Corleone has made his entire reputation on his reasonableness. He never gets upset. He never becomes angry. He looks people in the eyes. He speaks the truth. And the irony is, he is a character who is quite moral.
Right, right. Interesting.
But he's moral in a world in which he is, in fact, a crime boss and a criminal, and people have been murdered on his command. And he has certainly been involved in illegal businesses, gambling and prostitution, and all manner of illegal imports. And during the 1920s, he was involved in bootlegging. But one of the chief conflicts in the story is the move to narcotics, and he's very against that move because he feels that not only would that damage his business credibility with police, with judges, with the church, and whatever other organizations he's managed to finagle protection from, but also because he finds it personally repugnant. He says, alcohol or drug or prostitution or gambling are things that they're vices that people readily swarm to. Even the most moral people will turn to those vices in times. But he says drugs is a different thing entirely. I do think that Puzo was trying to show that transition that many of these families went through. He actually starts earlier in the novel, or in the middle of the novel, when we get his backstory. Part of his backstory is his legitimate business is as an oil importer, an olive oil importer. But that is a front for so many other businesses. And it becomes less and less important as the criminal. I mean, he does start as a criminal, but as he moves more into that direction, as getting imports of oil during World War II became more difficult, he moved into more criminal intents. The next part of the book, the latter part of the book, is when his youngest son, Michael, who he never wanted to go into the family business, moves into that leadership role. And his struggle is to legitimize the family businesses. He wants to move as much as he can away from the criminal aspect of what they do. He wants to have children who are senators. He wants to have, the goal that there's even a passage in which the Godfather talks about legitimizing their families and having their children become elected officials and become senators and presidents, because that's where he would like to see it go too, but he knows he's too buried in it. That's one of the reasons he wanted his son. His son was a decorated World War II, a decorated Marine. He didn't want him to become a Marine. He wanted him to get an education and become Senator Corleone. But because of the turn of events, he becomes the Godfather.
So what's the rough setting time period of the book?
I was going to mention that earlier. I forgot to do that. It starts off early in the 20th century when Don Corleone, Vito Corleone, is a young man. It goes into his backstory of his father's murder in Sicily by elements of the mafia,
so like
La Cosa
1910,
Nostra. Yeah, that kind of time period. And then it goes into his youth in New York and becoming a crime figure. And then the very beginning of the novel, that's all told in sort of in flashback. The very beginning of the novel is the end of World War II. So it's when Michael has come back from World War II. It's at his daughter's, Vito's daughter's wedding. I think it's 1946 is when it begins. And then it goes from there. It moves beyond that into the post-war time, because that's when the battle, the war happens after that event. And then when Michael becomes the Godfather later after that. So, So really it's interesting that it's told in the wake of World War I and then World War II.
Some real social, cultural changes there.
One of the characters' name is Buonasera, which I think is good. And I thought that was interesting. He's one of the first characters we meet in the story. Is Buonasera, and that's one of the first characters who interacts with the Don after World War II is over. And it's fascinating.
Okay, so just to reflect a little bit on this model book talk. Obviously, we cut it a little bit short, just for the interest of time, because it is a model. But as the scorer of this book talk, I would say that it definitely exceeded the standard But as far as some very basic, looking at our 3 standards, RL1, RL2, and SL1, the student, Mr. Rush, had obviously read and understood the book, was able to move and make connections in the book in a very smooth and thoughtful way, not just, this happened here, this happened here, this happened here, but actually connect by themes and by the overall point that the author was trying to make. And so there was no question in my mind but that he had read the book and he had understood the book and he had thought about the book. And so that takes care of a good number of these standards right off the bat. I did ask some questions that I wasn't 100% clear on myself. I hadn't read the book before, and so that enabled me to kind of touch base on, okay, so, is this a theme, or would you really say that it's more informational? So that was interesting, and I think he did a good job of bringing out those ideas. Anyone would think you were a trained professional.
I do my best.
And then the preparation and the polish. He had the passages picked out, but again, he was really talking. He wasn't, reading off a sheet of paper. And so there was clear preparation, clear forethought, and again, reflection on both the events of the book and the themes that come out of the book. So each of those exceeds standards were absolutely clear. For students who are looking for opportunities to exceed, if you notice, some of the things that I noticed immediately were when he was able to say things like, well, this reminded me of another book that I've read. And he was able to make a very clear connection to Moby Dick and how that book was put together. And then also when I asked him a question, he referred to different areas in the book specifically. Later in the book, this changes. We've talked a lot in class about how change is an important idea in a lot of novels. And if you can make those kind of connections, again, that just shows your ability to understand and discuss on a high level. So if we go to the flip side of the sheet, I would say that all of those categories were in the wow category. I think it would be perfectly possible for someone to meet in a much more restricted book talk, where you really are reading your first passage, talking about it. Maybe your teacher asks you 2 or 3 quick follow-up questions, and then in the second one, you hand the book to the person and say, here, you can read this passage, here's why I chose it, et cetera, et cetera. So, there was a lot of polish and preparation here, but I think if you think about the content, did he show that he read the book? That's kind of RL1. Did he show that he understood the bigger purposes that the author had and the bigger messages that the author had? That's RL2. And did he prepare and practice what he was going to be doing? That was SL1. And I think everybody should be able to see how clearly those answers were yes, yes, yes. And that's basically what you're looking at for a particular book talk.